Yes, we are enacting a sort of freedom, I dare say, through our medium. And I dare say, let's make the most of it. For this conversation, I somehow feel that we need a bridge between Hungary and Britain in cultural terms, and perhaps there is no better person than Arthur Koestler. Koestler famously argued in the Act of Creation that freedom is something that we can and we should create. We should be creative about freedom. And I think this was quite a remarkable statement for someone who had experienced, shall we say, the traumas of ideological conditions to an extreme. And it strikes me a rather fitting opening, perhaps, to our conversation, in the sense that I simply wanted to ask you, how do you feel in terms of the ability that one still has in Hungary or hasn't got in Hungary to be creative about freedom?
I don't want to go into history far too deep, but perhaps it's unavoidable. Perhaps I should mention one or two facts. One I think is quite relevant, important. It is that Hungary historically lost its independence in the first third of the 16th century, and for 4 centuries it was colonized, oppressed by various powers, and consequently freedom in Hungary coincided with independence, sovereignty, and that affects, I think, how lots of my fellow countrymen feel about freedom. It's mostly political freedom and mostly the freedom of a community, that is sovereignty, and not so much the freedom of the individual.
In closer to our home, academia. You mentioned the history of Hungary in broad strokes. I think this was very helpful indeed, because we need contexts. And we need historical context to understand what is actually happening in the present day. But if we concentrate simply on the 20th century here, and these very important phases that you have described, would you argue that from the point of view of academia, the point of view of universities, is there a major difference between, say, Horthy, Januzkadar and Aubam?
Certainly, there are differences. But I have to go back possibly a bit before the Horthy regime that started after the First World War, with the compromise between the Austria and Hungary, sort of this, when the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was established, there started a previously unimaginable and unheard of development economically, but also in the academia. We had I think, a man of sort of a huge format was Minister of Culture and Education, and they launched projects, founded university, erected university buildings, and so on and so on. And I have, ironically, or not so ironically, bitterly, I would say that Hungary has been destroying what that man or a couple of statesmen designed and established and erected. So this country has been destroying that ever since. And it still, to some extent, stands. But this, I think, is crucial. Under Horthy, culture was important, since it added to sort of the national self-esteem. But there were all sorts of problems. This country suffers from some sort of a bipolarity, you see. So you would hear Hungarians boasting with the number of Nobel Prize awarded scientists, fine. But on the other hand, if you closely examine, these Nobel Prize awarded scientists were almost all, with one single exception, Jews expelled from this country. And there is just only one person who received the Nobel Award based on researches done in this country. So some sort of a bipolarity, isn't it? Qatar was preceded by a couple of years, very, very rigorous, strict and cruel Stalinism in Hungary. So actually Qatar started to rebuild this country in the early 60s. And I think there had been a contract in the Qatar regime between the power, the party, or the government, and the academia, meaning universities, and to some extent the Academy of Sciences, research institutes, but mostly universities. It was a very, very cynical contract, I think. Salaries were extremely low. You can hardly survive on a professorial salary. The equipment of universities was pathetic indeed. No library development, no nothing, no sabbatical for university professors, no support for attending conferences, whatever, or just for a very few reliable persons. But in exchange, they simply let you alone. You could do what you could, and if you had some achievement, it was good for you and for your students, and indirectly for the country. But it meant you could follow this course, actually a career in the academia, if either you could afford it, you had a good family background, relatively well-off husband or wife who financed your travels to conferences, whatever, or if you were sort of obsessed, he was a compulsive researcher who simply did not mind, well, not starving, but poor conditions, circumstances. After the changes, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the second was the first, of course, the contract was simply cancelled or dissolved by the various ruling parties. Cost considerations started to be sort of decisive, and the empty framework of this contract, which anyone in the academia was allowed to use and sort of fill in with content, was made more rigorous, harsher, and professor was or university people from the academia were called to account for not meeting the standards, although the conditions were the same as said by the Qatar regime. So it was doubly cynical, I think. And there we are now. In the past several years, there have been a row of governmental interventions causing a huge international uproar. The CEU was expelled from the country, forced to move to Vienna. The Hungarian Academy of Sciences is a highly prestigious national institute founded in the early 19th century, was deprived of its research institutes. Consequently, money was taken away from them. And one of the victims of the privatization of state universities is the University of Theatre and Film Arts. There was a huge uproar. Organizations, institutes, and celebrated and highly respected individuals protested against these governmental steps. And we are all very, very grateful. But of course, we do know that such issues can be solved from within the country. Yet I do think that if we are for, and there are quite a few people in this country who are for, a united Europe, that is the idea of Europe as a common project, we do find it very important to stand up for these cases and have support from various European organizations, including the European Alliance of Academies.
Very interesting indeed. I mean, I will at some stage tell you a few thoughts on our situation in Britain, which is of course considerably different from yours, but there are some intriguing, dare I say it, similarities. I pricked up my ears when you mentioned cost effectiveness. I'm afraid this is one of the main tools of the present government in this country to exercise more or less direct influence on the way in which academia is shaped up in this country. Except that our universities here, as you know, they have financial autonomy, so to speak. And we depend, of course, a large extent on income from student fees. So that is a very interesting tool to change certain parameters for our academic life. But I wanted to come back to you, if I may, with another point. I remember distinctly one of my visits to your country, to Hungary, and two universities. It was the Erland Lötvesz University in Budapest, and it was a private university as well. I think it must have been in the mid-90s. They were just about to build things up in Székesfehérvár.
Kodolányi.
Yeah,
it was more like college, perhaps.
It was a college type, yes. In any case, for some odd reason, they invited me to come and look at this, and they somehow presented this as a new alternative to, shall we say, the state-run university. So it was obviously an attempt to economize in all respects. Yeah. I wanted to ask you whether under the present government, or shall we say regime, I'm not quite sure, whether these kind of private enterprises in the education sector, in higher education, do they have a future? Are they supported at all? Because the private sector would somehow represent, I mean, the Székesfehérvár experience suggested to me that they want to exercise more independence within the academic system. Is this still the case?
Not anymore, I'm afraid.
Right.
But practically every segment of the country, that is education, culture, economics, under heavy centralization. Now, it's the irony of the paradox of the cases that we had state universities. Almost every university was state university, except for CEU, the Central European University, which had been expelled from this country, forced to move to Vienna, where they are possibly happy. And I think it was a kind of a tragedy as regards the case of higher education in this country, that CEU is only partially here anymore. But state universities now are privatized. They are transformed into foundations. So you would logically claim that, well, then there we are now, state universities transformed into foundations would represent this sort of the private higher education system as anywhere in the world, from the USA to the UK or elsewhere. But these foundations are would represent the present ruling party and government, members of the board of these foundations are businessmen, one or two persons from the culture close to the ruling party, the Fidesz. So they are reliable, sort of trustworthy fellows of men in power. The reason behind this is that, well, it's sort of an appropriation of public money, public valuables to private hands, so that once the Fidesz rule is over, let's say they lose the next election, universities, the academia, and other segments, other parts that would make the country function will be in their own hands. So they actually survive that way. They extend their rule, their control over very important, strategically very important positions. Privatization is just sort of a paradoxical nationalization.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, this is a phenomenon which is not too completely alien to the UK, because since the days of Margaret Thatcher, the idea of intensified privatization often meant in reality more power to the government. So I share this view that we are in a paradox here that is somewhat striking. I was very interested in your comment that Hungary in so many ways suffered, continues to suffer perhaps, from what one could call a kind of post-colonial, post-imperial.
That's right, precisely.
And that, of course, would bring things closer in terms of comparison with Ireland, with the Republic of Ireland. Except that, of course, in Ireland, we have in the Republic at least, we have a very flourishing democracy. We have a firmly established democracy. And we have an academic life in the Republic of Ireland, which is highly commendable. It's a very interesting scenario there. When it comes to the UK, when it comes to my experience here, which started when I came as a student to this country in 1981, what has happened as of late, of course in connection with Brexit, but long before, was a gradual winding down of, shall we say, anything that had to do with European studies. A winding down of some excellent departments in European studies that we had in the UK, with very good research results, etc., etc. But they found themselves more and more constrained by financial considerations, by the way in which they could attract or not attract overseas students, etc.
Could
This
they
was
not?
the first wave.
Could they not attract overseas students?
Whether they could attract or not attract. Yes, yes, it was both somehow.
But I would suppose they could.
Yes, they did, and they did very well. We had,
it was cost effective if you...
It was initially cost effective, yes.
So is it a case of sort of insularity as an ideological?
You see, I never buy the idea of insularity because, frankly, Ireland is an island too. And the Republic of Ireland is very pro-European. The agenda in England, to be precise, Scotland is different, but the agenda in England is definitely something that has to do with what you said earlier on, namely this fiction of state sovereignty, this fiction of independence, and in a sense, the negation of the realization that we basically are all in one boat. And the fact that England in particular lives currently in denial as far as the, shall we say, very strong links, fundamental links with the European continent are concerned, and is dreaming of a, shall we say, revitalization of the Commonwealth idea, and the idea that the Commonwealth, also the students from the Commonwealth, could replace those students whom we had from Europe.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing is that if you talk about overseas students, then you can expect higher fees. And the fee income, as I said, is crucial. Now, when I said about the winding down of European studies as a topic, as a subject at university level in the UK, the next step is something we're experiencing now, namely a narrowing of the scope for modern languages. The modern philologies are definitely under threat, and in particular, the European languages. So our fundamental basis in the humanities in the UK, namely this interlinking with European languages, is definitely under threat. And that is now done under the heading of cost efficiency. Because the argument is that in particular after Brexit, European languages are not used anymore. That is the fiction. And the other fiction is that everyone else speaks English, and that's wonderful and fine. And so no one else needs to learn modern languages. We have, of course, a number of colleagues who have produced remarkable work in this field. Very recently, a distinguished colleague from Oxford, Katrin Kohl, she published almost a pamphletic book on modern languages and the necessity for this country, also in economic terms, to continue to invest in modern languages. But precisely the opposite is happening. And that, to me, also is an indication of a very indirect but very effective form of curtailing academic freedom.
Yeah.
That is something which, you know, we normally don't discuss in this country, because we say, yes, we have, of course, academic freedom, and this is wonderful and marvelous, and we have the best universities, etc., etc. But the reality is that you can curtail academic freedom in this way too, by simply limiting the number of subjects, by narrowing the scope of particular subjects and briefs.
When it comes to that in Britain, can you detect some sort of a political will? Can you link such decisions to the Conservative Party or the Labour? Since you see in Hungary there is always an immediate, you can immediately connect it to a political, ideological trend, brutally.
I have to say, in England, you can't.
No, yeah.
This is the problem. This is the real problem. It would be so easy for us to say, well, we can blame those.
No, it's not easy, Rüdiger.
We can't. But you have the problem that, shall we say, from the Conservatives, from the Tories to Labour, there was precious little support for, shall we say, the modern languages. The idea, the cultural idea behind modern languages, in particular versus Europe. We have, of course, a split, as we know, within the Tories and within Labour as far as the Brexit was concerned. And we have a situation where only a fairly impotent Liberal Party somehow, you know, holds up the flag for European matters. We have one member of the Green Party in the whole of the Commons. This is all, right? Mm-hmm. And it just illustrates where we stand in terms of the difficulty to identify the real culprits here. Yeah. You see, the depressing thing is that the curtailing of modern languages at school level, this is where it started years ago. This happened under Labour. This happened under a Labour administration. And the Tories were only too happy to continue this. But what I'm saying is, when you have a government, as we have currently, and probably for the foreseeable future, where a prime minister, a sitting prime minister, says a few months ago that under no circumstances would the UK leave the Erasmus programme. And only 5 months later, the same prime minister announced, certainly we will leave the Erasmus programme, because we have now another idea that is more encompassing, global, and we call this thing the Turing programme. Now, the bad news is that no one clearly knows how this Turing programme should replace Erasmus+. No one knows the proper criteria for Turing at this moment. Yeah. But we are basically left in limbo. We only know that this program is supposed to serve the, shall we say, post-Brexit and post-European strategy for our universities. We should now go into the Far East. We should attract Southern American students. But how the system itself will pan out, we simply don't know. Oh. And the other major difference to the Erasmus program is that probably from 2023 onwards, British universities will have to apply on a yearly basis for funding from the Turing program. Whilst under the Erasmus scheme, as we know, as you know, this was a given. You didn't have to reapply every year. It was simply an arrangement between universities and between the countries that paid into the Erasmus scheme. And that was it. You could rely on it. You could build a firm, shall we say, partnership program or series of programs on that basis. If you have to reapply every year under Turing, you can't, in that sense, build up a credible continuity of international academic collaboration. And that is a severe problem that we face. It
is. Yeah. Since before Erasmus, universities built up individually, connecting each to each such programs, and Erasmus is or has been a true blessing, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, certainly our Minister for Education and Gavin Williamson, and one of the departments of this ministry, which is interestingly called the Office for Students, which is one of the wonderful UK ways of camouflaging a particular brief. Both of them can't see that the Erasmus Plus system was one of the major, shall we say, advancements and benefits for this country, for the UK.
what is alarming, I think, is that you say that in Britain, no matter which party gave the prime minister and most of the government members of the government, higher education was not sort of promoted or developed. Same in Hungary after 1990. We had socialist liberal governments 3 times. This national populist right-wing government, but higher education and education as such has always been on the slope, put on the slope. It just occurred to me that since there are these things in common, but there are huge differences, I always have the feeling that there is a line, and you are sort of beyond that line and deteriorating perhaps, and crumbling universities, the opportunities are crumbling and tend to reach that line perhaps, but we are far below, so beneath this line, and we are trying to climb up, but we can never reach that level you are afraid of
Yes.
to be pulled down.
Yes, indeed, indeed. All the rest is pretense. The rest is pretense in the sense that one always claims one has achieved these things. One claims one is the best in the world and this kind of thing. But the problem is that this doesn't help us at all. And one of the reasons that you alluded to, indeed, neither the universities nor the academic sector in general, nor the intellectuals ever had a proper lobby in this country. The status of the public intellectual is not even remotely comparable to continental experiences, of course. Now, in Hungary, I'm sure the problem is that many of your public intellectuals have left.
That's right, but humanities and intellectual life was, I think I can put it into past tense, was sort of overrated before, due to what I was trying to say about the idea of independence as national sovereignty, even at the cost of individual freedom, the freedom of the individual being sort of, overlooked or sometimes simply mutilated or disregarded. So then, for that reason, for short periods or longer periods, education, culture, let's say writers, seem to be very, very important factors in the cultural life of this country. But that was pretense again. That did not mean at all it was sort of a highly educated country devouring the latest books of its writers and poets and celebrity authors. It's over now. It's over now.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, my final word in this discussion here, as far as Britain is concerned, would be that it is ironic, is it not? You spoke of paradoxes earlier on. It is ironic that one of the finest universities that we have on these shores, namely University College London, University College London was modelled, when it was founded in 1834, it was modelled on the Humboldt University type, with academic freedom inscribed, with the unity, as it were, of research and teaching, the identity almost, identity making of the Einheit von Forschung und Lehre, as the Germans call this. And exactly this bringing together of research and teaching this is something which is seriously under threat here. What we find is more and more that, in particular at undergraduate level, colleagues are more and more encouraged to focus on a teaching that is not necessarily anymore research informed. It is a very functional teaching. And the functionality of teaching really has, in many ways, devalued what we once stood for, namely the idea of learning for learning's sake. And we all speak of lifelong learning, and this kind of thing is all wonderful. And again, we're talking about a lot of window dressing. But the idea that there is something that could be called learning for learning's sake is out of the window. And I'm afraid also in the context of this situation, the utilitarians, they have won. They have won, unfortunately. And we are completely absorbed and obsessed with identifying aims and objectives for our respective course modules. But the one major aim and objective is always omitted, namely learning for learning's sake, discovering things for the sake of discovering them, and only in the second place ask, how can we apply this? And that is my main concern as far as the academic world here is concerned, and the idea of university as an institution for some idea of universality is completely gone. And that worries me greatly.
I'm afraid I must agree. Yeah, although different political regimes reign in our countries, but as regards the position of the university, the position of learning and education, it's roughly the same. Sadly enough.
What a strange consensus we have at the end. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.